I'm Jasmine Flores, 27 years old. Until 3 months ago, I believed family meant everything. Then the reading of my grandmother's will changed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and blood. I sat in that sterile law office, watching my cousin Carter smirk as the lawyer announced he'd inherited Nana's house, her art collection. Everything she'd promised would be mine. My grandmother's final words to me still echo. "Promise me you'll take care of the house, mija. It's yours now." What Carter and his mother didn't know was that I had been caring for Nana every single day for the past 2 years, reading to her, tending her garden, being the granddaughter who showed up. But here's what makes this story even more unbelievable. I found Nana's handwritten letter hidden in her nightstand, dated just days before she died. But how could a will be changed after someone's death? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The keys to Nana's Victorian house felt cold in my palm as I stood on the wraparound porch that Saturday morning, 3 days before everything fell apart. The house sat perched on the bluffs overlooking the Pacific, its weathered shingles and climbing roses telling stories of a century's worth of Harrington family memories. I'd been coming here every weekend since I was 6 years old, when my mother dropped me off and never came back. "Morning, mija," Nana had called from the kitchen that last Saturday, her voice carrying that familiar warmth that had been my anchor for 21 years. Eleanor Harrington was 83 then, still sharp as her best pruning shears, still insisting on making her famous tres leches cake from scratch every time I visited. I kicked off my shoes at the door, house rules since childhood, and found her arranging fresh lavender in her favorite blue ceramic vase. The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows caught the silver in her hair, making her look almost ethereal. She'd been beautiful once, in that old Hollywood way, with high cheekbones and eyes that missed nothing. Even at 83, she carried herself like royalty. "I've been thinking about the memoir again," she said, not looking up from her flowers. We'd been working on her life story for months, recording her memories on my old laptop, organizing family photos, cataloging the stories behind each piece of art that covered her walls. "The chapter about Papa's art collection?" I asked, settling into my usual spot at the kitchen table. The table itself was a work of art, a massive oak piece that had belonged to her own grandmother, scarred with decades of family meals and conversations. "No, mija, the chapter about you." She finally looked at me then, her brown eyes serious. "About how you saved this old woman from becoming just another bitter rich lady with too many cats." I laughed, but she wasn't joking. Nana never joked about family. "You know," she continued, moving to the stove where coffee was already brewing, "I've been meaning to update some of my paperwork, legal stuff, boring but necessary." "Need help with anything?" I asked, though I knew she'd refuse. Eleanor Harrington had been handling her own affairs since her husband died 15 years ago, and she wasn't about to start asking for help now. "Just want to make sure everything's in order. For you." She poured 2 cups of coffee, added cream to mine without asking. She knew exactly how I liked it. "This house, the art collection, all of it, it should go to someone who understands what it really means." The house was worth millions, though Nana never talked about money. The art collection was worth even more. Original pieces by Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, and other Mexican artists her grandfather had befriended in the 1940s. But to me, they weren't investments. They were the backdrop of my childhood, the faces that had watched over me during homework sessions and sick days. "Nana, you know I don't care about—" "I know you don't care about the money," she interrupted. "That's exactly why it should be yours." Crescent Bluffs had always been a town divided between the old families who'd built their fortunes in shipping and oil, and the working families who kept the place running. The Harringtons fell firmly into the first category, though Nana had never acted like it. She shopped at the same grocery store as everyone else, went to the same library, donated anonymously to half the charities in town. My apartment above Morrison's bookstore downtown couldn't have been more different from Nana's. Sprawling Victorian. I'd moved there after college, drawn by the cheap rent and the smell of old books that drifted up through the floorboards. It was tiny, just a studio with a Murphy bed and a kitchen the size of a closet. But it was mine. I made enough freelance, illustrating children's books to pay the bills, with Nana's occasional grocery money, helping when deadlines were tight. "Tell me about the Rivera again," I said, nodding toward the living room where a small but stunning piece hung above the fireplace. "The one Papa bought in Mexico City." Nana's face lit up. She loved telling this story. "Your great-grandfather was there on business, oil equipment, if you can believe it, and he wandered into this gallery. Diego himself was there, arguing with the owner about money. Papa didn't speak much Spanish then, but he understood art. He bought 3 pieces on the spot, paid cash, and told Diego the world would remember his name. Did he know how valuable they'd become? Papa always said art isn't valuable because it costs money. It's valuable because it connects you to something bigger than yourself." She gestured around the room, at the dozens of paintings and sculptures that filled every available space. "Every piece in this house has a story. That's what makes it worth preserving." I spent the afternoon helping her tend the garden, a sprawling maze of roses, lavender, and herbs that cascaded down the hillside toward the ocean. Nana moved slowly but deliberately, pruning dead blooms, checking for pests, talking to the plants like old friends. "Carter called yesterday," she mentioned casually, deadheading a particularly stubborn rose bush. I tried not to tense up. My cousin, Carter, technically my second cousin, son of Nana's late son Robert, rarely called unless he needed something. "What did he want?" "To check on me. Make sure I'm eating enough vegetables." She snorted. "As if I haven't been keeping myself alive. Just fine for 83 years. Carter Harrington had always been the golden boy of the family, with his Ivy League education and his job at some prestigious investment firm in San Francisco. He was handsome in that polished way that came from expensive grooming and confidence. Tall and broad-shouldered, with perfectly styled dark hair and a smile that could sell anything. The few times I'd met him at family gatherings, he'd been charming and distant, the kind of person who remembered your name but not your story. "His mother sends her regards too," Nana added, and now I definitely tensed. Marla Harrington, Carter's mother and Robert's widow, was a different breed entirely. Where Nana was warm and down to earth, Marla was cold calculation wrapped in Chanel suits. She'd married into the Harrington name 30 years ago, and had spent every day since trying to prove she belonged there. After Robert died 5 years ago, she'd grown even more bitter, especially toward Nana. "I haven't seen Marla since Uncle Robert's funeral," I said carefully. "No, and you probably won't. We don't exactly see eye to eye on family matters." Nana's pruning shears snapped a little more aggressively than necessary. "She thinks money is more important than love. I think she's got it backwards." The sun was setting by the time we finished in the garden, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have made the artists on Nana's walls weep with envy. We sat on the back porch with glasses of wine, watching the waves crash against the rocks. Below, "Promise me something, mija," Nana said suddenly. "Anything. Promise me you'll always remember where you come from. Not the money or the house or any of that, but this." She gestured to the sunset, the garden, the comfortable silence between us. "This is what family really means." "I promise, Nana." She nodded, satisfied. "Good, because no matter what happens, that's something no one can take away from you." I should have asked her what she meant by "no matter what happens." I should have pressed her about the legal paperwork she'd mentioned. But I was 27, and still believed that people you love live forever, that promises made on garden porches under sunset skies are unbreakable. 3 days later, Eleanor Harrington was dead. The call came at 6 in the morning. I was still in bed, laptop balanced on my knees, working on illustrations for a picture book about a lonely elephant who learns to make friends. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Is this Jasmine Flores?" "Yes." "This is Dr. Martinez at Crescent Bluffs General Hospital. I'm calling about your grandmother, Eleanor Harrington." The world tilted sideways. "What about her?" "She was brought in early this morning by her housekeeper." "I'm sorry, but she passed away about an hour ago. It appears to have been a heart attack in her sleep." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. My laptop followed, the elephant illustration disappearing as the screen went black. Somewhere in my tiny apartment, I could hear the doctor still talking, but his words were underwater, sounds, meaningless noise that couldn't penetrate the sudden silence in my chest. Nana was gone. Just like that, without warning, without goodbye, the person who had raised me and loved me and promised me the world was gone. I don't remember getting dressed or driving to the hospital. I don't remember calling my boss to cancel my meetings or leaving a voicemail for Tessa. The next clear memory I have is standing in the hospital parking lot at 8 in the morning, staring up at a building that contained my grandmother's body, unable to make my feet move toward the door. She was supposed to live forever. In my mind, Eleanor Harrington was as permanent as the house on the bluffs, as enduring as the art collection she'd spent decades curating. The idea that her heart could simply stop, that all her stories and wisdom and love could just vanish overnight, was incomprehensible. But death doesn't care about your expectations. Death doesn't wait for convenient timing or final conversations or last-minute promises. Death just takes what it wants and leaves you standing in hospital parking lots, wondering how the world can keep spinning when your North Star has just gone dark. The funeral was small. Nana had specifically requested no big production. We gathered at St. Mary's by the Sea, the little Catholic church where she'd attended Mass every Sunday for 60 years. Father Miguel, who'd known her since he was a young priest fresh from seminary, spoke about her kindness, her quiet generosity, her devotion to family. Carter and Marla sat in the front row, dressed in expensive black and looking appropriately sorrowful. A few dozen other people filled the pews. Neighbors, friends from the Historical Society, people whose lives Nana had touched in ways big and small. I sat alone in the second row, clutching a tissue and trying not to think about how empty the house on the bluffs would feel. After the service, people filtered back to Nana's house for the reception. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, accepting condolences and trying to smile when people shared their favorite Eleanor stories. The house felt different already, like it knew its heart was gone. "She was so proud of you," Mrs. Chen from next door told me. "Always talking about your artwork, your sweet nature. You were her whole world." "Thank you," I managed. "I hope you'll keep the garden going," added Mr. Rodriguez, who'd helped Nana plant the roses 15 years ago. "She'd hate to see it go wild." "Of course," I said, though I had no idea how I was going to manage a garden this size from my apartment downtown. That's when it hit me. I didn't just inherit Nana's belongings. I inherited her responsibilities. The house, the garden, the art collection that needed proper care and climate control. The memoir we'd been working on together, half finished and stored on my laptop. The dozens of family photos that needed organizing. The stories that needed preserving. It was overwhelming and comforting at the same time. Nana had given me a purpose, a way to honor her memory while taking care of the things she'd loved most. 3 days after the funeral, I got the call about the will reading. The law office of Morrison, Blake & Associates occupied the top floor of a converted bank building downtown, all polished mahogany and intimidating leather-bound volumes that were probably just for show. I'd never been inside before. Nana had always handled her own legal affairs with characteristic independence. But I knew the reputation. Old money in Crescent Bluffs meant old lawyers, and Morrison, Blake & Associates had been handling Harrington, family business for 3 generations. I arrived early, clutching the ceramic travel mug Nana had given me for Christmas, filled with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The morning fog still clung to the coast, but patches of sunlight were beginning to break through, promising another beautiful California day that felt wrong without her here to share it. The receptionist, a woman with steel gray hair and reading, glasses on a pearl chain, looked up from her computer. "You must be Jasmine Flores." "Yes, I'm here for the Harrington will reading." "Of course, dear. I'm so sorry for your loss. Mrs. Harrington was a wonderful woman." Her sympathy seemed genuine, which shouldn't have surprised me. Nana had that effect on people. Even lawyers' receptionists remembered her fondly. "Thank you. Mr. Morrison will be with you shortly. You can wait in the conference room, second door on your right. There's coffee and pastries if you'd like." The conference room overlooked Main Street, where early morning shoppers were already browsing the farmers' market that set up every Thursday. From this angle, I could see Morrison's bookstore below, and my little apartment window above it. My whole world contained in a few city blocks, while Nana's world had sprawled across decades and continents and generations of stories. I was examining the framed photographs of Crescent Bluff's history when I heard voices in the hallway, familiar, voices that made my stomach clench with unexpected anxiety. "Told you this was just a formality," Carter was saying to someone. "The lawyers have to go through the motions, but we all know how much grandmother cared about maintaining family traditions." "Still," came Marla's voice, crisp with authority, "it's important to handle these things properly. Appearances matter." They walked into the conference room like they owned it, which, given the Harrington family's relationship with Morrison, Blake and Associates, they probably did. Carter looked every inch the successful investment banker in his charcoal suit and Italian leather shoes. Marla wore a black dress that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, paired with a string of pearls that had definitely belonged to some previous generation of Harrington women. "Jasmine," Carter said, his voice warm with just the right amount of grief. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," I lied. "Thank you for asking." He crossed the room to give me a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and felt like a performance. "Grandmother was so lucky to have you close by these last few years. I know how much that meant to her." Marla nodded agreement, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "You were always so devoted, dear." Eleanor appreciated that. There was something in the way she said it, like devotion was a nice hobby rather than genuine love, that made me bristle. But before I could respond, the door opened and Richard Morrison himself walked in. I'd seen him around town for years, but never up close. He was probably in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of bearing that came from decades of handling other people's most important business. His handshake was firm, his condolences sincere, and his manner suggested this was going to be straightforward and painless. "Thank you all for coming," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the polished conference table. "I know this is a difficult time, but Eleanor was very specific about wanting her affairs handled promptly." He opened a thick manila folder and withdrew several documents. "Eleanor's will is quite straightforward. She updated it recently, just 6 weeks ago, in fact, to ensure everything was in proper order. 6 weeks ago. That would have been right, around the time she'd mentioned updating her paperwork. I felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with sadness. Even in her final weeks, Nana had been thinking about my future, making sure I'd be taken care of. "The bulk of Eleanor's estate," Morrison continued, "including the family home at 47 Cliffside Drive, the complete art collection, and all financial assets, has been left to Carter Harrington, with provisions for his mother, Marla Harrington, to serve as co-executor until such time as she deems appropriate to transfer full control." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt my body recoil, my hands gripping the edge of the table as the room seemed to tilt sideways. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Could you repeat that?" Morrison looked at me with something like pity. "The estate goes to Carter, with Marla as co-executor. Eleanor did leave you a small bequest, Her jewelry box and $1,000 for remembrance of our time together. $1,000. And a jewelry box. 21 years of being raised by this woman, of weekend visits and garden work, and late-night conversations about art and life and family. 21 years of being told I was the granddaughter of her heart, that the house would always be my home, that the art collection was my heritage to preserve, and she'd left me a jewelry box and enough money to cover a month's rent. There must be some mistake, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I could see there wasn't. Morrison's expression was professionally neutral. Carter looked appropriately, surprised by my reaction, and Marla's face showed just the faintest hint of satisfaction. I understand this comes as a shock, Morrison said gently. Inheritance decisions can be surprising, even within families. But I assure you, this is Eleanor's final will and testament, properly witnessed and notarized. When did she change it? I asked. 6 weeks ago, you said? That's correct. She came in on March 15th to make these revisions. March 15th. I tried to remember what I'd been doing that day, whether Nana had seemed different during our visit that weekend. But everything blurred together. All our conversations about the house, about preserving family history, about making sure the art collection went to someone who understood its value. Did she say why she was making changes? My voice sounded strange, distant. Morrison glanced at Carter and Marla before answering. She expressed concerns about ensuring the estate would be properly managed by someone with business experience. She wanted to make sure the family assets would be preserved for future generations. Business experience. As if 21 years of love and devotion counted for nothing compared to an MBA and a corporate job. I don't understand, I said, and I really didn't. This wasn't the woman who had raised me. This wasn't the grandmother who had spent hours teaching me about Diego Rivera's political passion and Frida Kahlo's emotional honesty. This wasn't the person who had looked me in the eye 3 days before her death and made me promise to remember where I came from. Jasmine, Carter said, leaning forward with what looked like genuine concern. I know this is hard to hear. I was shocked too when the lawyers called me. I had no idea grandmother was planning to make these changes. Liar, I thought, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the way his surprise felt rehearsed, or how quickly Marla had started talking about handling these things properly. Maybe it was just the gut instinct that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Of course, Carter continued, you know you'll always be welcome at the house. It's your childhood home too. And if there are any specific pieces of art that have sentimental value, I'm sure we can work something out. Sentimental value. Like the Rivera wasn't worth $500,000. Like the Kahlo self-portrait wasn't a museum-quality piece. Like any of this was about sentiment instead of justice. I need to go, I said, standing abruptly. My legs felt unsteady, but I managed to gather my purse and coffee mug without dropping anything. Jasmine, wait, Morrison called. There are documents. You need to sign. Procedures to... I'll come back, I said. I just need to process this. I walked out of that conference room and down the stairs and onto Main Street without looking back, my heart pounding and my mind reeling. The farmer's market was in full swing now. Vendors calling out prices for organic strawberries and fresh-baked bread. Tourists browsing handmade jewelry and local art. Normal people living normal lives while my entire world collapsed. I found myself walking toward the bluffs without deciding to, my feet carrying me along the familiar path to Nana's house. The morning fog had burned off completely now, and the Victorian looked almost ethereal in the bright sunlight, its weathered shingles and climbing roses exactly as they'd been 4 days ago when I'd last seen them. Except now they belonged to Carter. I stood at the garden gate, looking up at the wraparound porch where Nana and I had shared our last conversation. The roses she'd been pruning were already starting to bloom again, pale pink petals unfurling toward the sun. In a few weeks, they'd be glorious. By next month, they'd need deadheading again. Who was going to take care of them? Carter lived in San Francisco, and traveled constantly for work. Marla had never shown any interest in gardening. Would they hire someone? Would they just let the garden go wild? Would they even care enough to water the herbs and vegetables Nana had planted with such hope for the summer harvest? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My phone buzzed with a text from Tessa. "How did it go? Coffee later?" I stared at the message, trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened. How do you tell your best friend that the person you loved most in the world apparently didn't love you back? How do you admit that you'd been living in a fantasy, believing you were the cherished granddaughter when you were really just the convenient caretaker? Instead of answering, I called her. "Jazz? What's wrong? You sound... Can you meet me at Nana's house?" I interrupted. "I need to tell you something, and I can't do it over the phone." "Of course. Give me 20 minutes. I hung up and let myself into the garden through the side gate. I still had keys, though probably not for much longer. The garden was exactly as we'd left it that last Saturday, except for the absence of Eleanor Harrington's voice calling my name from the kitchen window. I sat on the stone bench beside the herb garden, breathing in the scent of rosemary and lavender, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Nana had been sharp until the end. There was no question of dementia or confusion. She'd made these changes deliberately, for reasons I couldn't begin to understand, unless she hadn't made them. At all. The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. What if something was wrong with the will? What if someone had influenced her decision, or pressured her, but that was crazy. Morrison, Blake and Associates wasn't some fly-by-night operation. They'd been handling Harrington business for decades. Richard Morrison himself had probably known Nana longer than I'd been alive. If there was something fishy about the will, he'd have noticed. Wouldn't he? Tessa arrived exactly 20 minutes later, her short black hair still damp from the shower, and her paralegal instincts already on high alert. She took one look at my face and sat down beside me on the bench. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. I told her about the will reading, about Carter inheriting everything, about the jewelry box and $1,000 that represented my entire legacy from the woman who'd raised me. I told her about Morrison's explanation, about business experience, and proper management, about how none of it made sense with the grandmother I'd known and loved. Tessa listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. 6 weeks ago she changed it, she asked when I finished. That's what Morrison said. March 15th. Did anything happen around then? Any family drama, health scares, anything that might have influenced her thinking? I tried to remember. Carter called her that week, the weekend I was there. She mentioned it while we were gardening. Said he wanted to check on her eating habits. Eating habits? Tessa repeated, her voice flat. Yeah, it seemed weird to me too. But Nana just laughed. "It off. What about Marla? Any contact with her?" Nana said she sent her regards through Carter, but they hadn't spoken directly in years. Tessa was quiet for a moment, staring out at the ocean. As a paralegal at a family law firm, she'd seen her share of inheritance disputes and family drama. She knew the warning signs of elder abuse, undue influence, all the ways vulnerable people could be manipulated. "Jazz," she said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. In all the years you knew your grandmother, in all your conversations about family and money in the future, did she ever give you any reason to think she didn't trust you with her legacy?" "No," I said immediately. "Never. She was always talking about preserving the art collection, making sure it went to someone who understood its value. She spent hours teaching me about each piece, their history, their significance. Why would she do that if she planned to leave everything to Carter?" "She wouldn't," Tessa said firmly. "Which means either something happened to change her mind in those final weeks, or the will isn't legitimate." "Exactly." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of that possibility settling between us. If the will was fraudulent, if someone had forged Nana's signature or pressured her into making changes she didn't really want, then this wasn't just about money or property. This was about justice. "What do I do?" I asked. "First, we need to see the original documents. I can help you request copies through proper channels. You have a right to examine the will as a named beneficiary. Then we start looking for inconsistencies. Anything that doesn't match your grandmother's usual patterns or handwriting. And if we find something, then we fight," Tessa said simply. "We fight for what's right." I looked up at the house where I'd spent the happiest years of my childhood, where every room held memories of the woman who'd shaped me into the person I was today. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, probably illuminating the Rivera above the fireplace and the Kahlo in the hallway and all the other treasures that Carter would soon control. "Okay," I said. "Let's fight." That evening, I sat in my tiny apartment above the bookstore, surrounded by boxes of Nana's personal items that I'd collected from the house over the years. Photo albums, letters, birthday cards, little mementos that told the story of our relationship better than any legal document. The jewelry box Morrison had mentioned sat unopened on my kitchen table, its presence both a comfort and an accusation. I couldn't bring myself to open it yet. Opening it would make this real, would acknowledge that a jewelry box and $1,000 were all I had left of Eleanor Harrington's love. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and opened the memoir file we'd been working on together. Dozens of documents containing Nana's stories, organized by decade and theme. Her childhood during the Depression, her marriage to my grandfather, the children she'd raised and lost, the art collection that had become her passion project. I scrolled through until I found the section about family, about her hopes for the future. "Family isn't about blood or money," she dictated while I typed. "It's about showing up. It's about caring more about someone else's happiness than your own comfort. Jasmine understands this. She's been showing up for me every weekend for 21 years, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. That's the kind of person who should inherit more than money. She should inherit the responsibility of caring for the things I've loved." I read the passage 3 times, my heart breaking a little more with each word. This wasn't the voice of a woman planning to leave everything to a grandson she barely knew. This was someone who understood the difference between inheritance and legacy, between ownership and stewardship. My phone rang, interrupting my spiral into confusion and grief. Carter's name appeared on the screen. "Hello?" "Jasmine, hi. I hope I'm not calling too late." His voice was warm, concerned. "I wanted to check on you after this morning. I know the will reading was difficult." "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. "Listen, I've been thinking about what I said earlier, about the house always being open to you. I meant that. And I want you to know that I'd like your input on how to care for grandmother's art collection. You know those pieces better than anyone. My input, like I was a consultant, rather than the person who'd spent years learning the story. Behind each painting, each sculpture, each carefully chosen addition to Eleanor's curated collection. That's generous of you," I managed. "I was also thinking about the memoir you two were working on. I'd love to see it completed, maybe even published. Grandmother's story deserves to be told." "We were almost finished," I said. "Just a few more chapters about her later years." "Perfect. Maybe we could work together on that? I could provide some family perspective from the business side, and you could handle the personal memories." The business side, as if Nana's life was divided into professional and personal categories, as if her relationships with family could be reduced to financial transactions. "I'll think about it," I said. "Of course, take your time. There's no rush on any of this." He paused. "Jasmine, I hope you know that yesterday's news doesn't change how much grandmother loved you. Sometimes people make decisions that don't make sense to the rest of us, but that doesn't diminish the relationship you had with her." After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone. Carter was saying all the right things, expressing exactly the kind of concern and generosity you'd expect from someone who'd just inherited millions. So why did every word feel calculated? Why did his sympathy sound like a script? I opened the jewelry box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were the pieces I remembered Nana wearing. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to her mother, a pair of pearl earrings that had been a gift from my grandfather. Beautiful things, but not valuable in the way Carter's inheritance was valuable. Sentimental rather than significant, in Morrison's terms. But underneath the jewelry, my fingers found something unexpected. A folded piece of paper. I pulled it out carefully, recognizing Nana's handwriting immediately. It was a letter, written in the purple ink she always preferred, dated just 5 days before her death. "My dearest Jasmine," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've discovered that my final will was not what we discussed. I want you to know that whatever the lawyers tell you, whatever documents they produce, my true intentions have not changed. You are my heart, my legacy, my chosen heir in every way that matters." My hands started shaking. I had to set the letter down and take several deep breaths before I could continue reading. "I have reason to believe that certain family members may try to contest my wishes after my death. I have tried to protect against this, but I fear my age and recent health concerns may be used against me. If something seems wrong about my will, trust your instincts. You know me better than anyone, mija. You know what I would and wouldn't do." The letter went on for 2 more paragraphs, full of love and encouragement, and reminders of the promises we'd made to each other. It ended with an address I didn't recognize, and a simple instruction. "If you need help, Mrs. Rodriguez knows what to do. Mrs. Rodriguez, Nana's housekeeper for the past 15 years. A quiet woman in her 60s who came 3 times a week to help with cleaning and meal preparation. I'd chatted with her dozens of times, but never about anything more substantial than the weather or Nana's health. I grabbed my phone and called Tessa. "I found something," I said as soon as she answered. "Nana left me a letter, hidden in the jewelry box." "What does it say?" I read the entire letter aloud, my voice getting steadier with each word. By the time I finished, I felt something I hadn't experienced since walking out of Morrison's office. Hope. Holy shit, Jazz. She knew something was going to happen. It sounds like she was expecting someone to challenge her will. But if that's true, why didn't she take steps to prevent it? Maybe she did, and we just haven't found them yet. "What's this address she mentions?" I looked at the paper again. 1247 Seaview Drive. I've never heard of it. I'll look it up, and first thing tomorrow we're going to talk to Mrs. Rodriguez. What do I tell her? "Hi, my grandmother's housekeeper. Did you help her hide evidence of will fraud?" "Leave that to me," Tessa said. "I know how to ask the right questions." The next morning, I met Tessa at a coffee shop near the Bluffs, both of us running on caffeine and determination. She'd done her research on Seaview Drive. It was a small residential street about 10 minutes from Nana's house, lined with modest homes that had been built in the 1960s for middle-class families. "Number 1247 belongs to a woman named Carmen Rodriguez," Tessa said. "Age 62, has lived there for 20 years. Ring any bells?" "That's definitely Mrs. Rodriguez's first name, but I don't understand why Nana would send me to her house instead of just talking to her at work. Maybe because whatever Mrs. Rodriguez knows, your grandmother didn't want it discovered at the house. Maybe she was worried about surveillance, or someone overhearing." The idea that Nana had been living in fear during her final weeks made my chest tight with anger. Eleanor Harrington had been a force of nature, someone who faced life's challenges head-on. If she'd been worried enough to hide evidence and leave cryptic instructions, something serious had been happening. We drove to Seaview Drive in Tessa's beat-up Honda, winding through neighborhoods that grew progressively less expensive as we moved away from the ocean. Carmen Rodriguez's house was a small ranch-style home with a well-maintained front yard and flower boxes under every window. It looked like the kind of place where someone might hide secrets. Mrs. Rodriguez answered, the door on the second knock, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to recognition, to something like relief when she saw me. Jasmine, she said, I was wondering when you would come. Mrs. Rodriguez, I found my grandmother's letter. She said you would know what to do. Come in, both of you. We have much to discuss. Her living room was small but comfortable, decorated, with family photos and religious icons. She offered us coffee, then settled into an armchair across from the couch where Tessa and I sat. Your grandmother was very worried in her final months, she began without preamble. She told me things, asked me to keep things safe. She said if anything happened to her, if her will was not what it should be, I should help you. What kind of things? I asked. Mrs. Rodriguez stood and walked to a bookshelf in the corner, pulling out what looked like a photo album. But when she opened it, I could see it was actually a collection of documents, photos, and handwritten notes. She made copies, Mrs. Rodriguez said, setting the album on the coffee table between us. Every time someone visited, every phone call, every meeting with lawyers, she wrote it all down, took pictures, kept records. Tessa leaned forward, her paralegal instincts engaged. This is documentation of potential undue influence. What does that mean? I asked. It means if someone was pressuring your grandmother to change her will, if they were manipulating her or threatening her or taking advantage of her age or health, that's grounds to contest the will's validity. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded. She was very smart, Mrs. Eleanor. She knew something bad was happening, but she needed proof. I opened the album to the first page. It was a photo of Nana's calendar, with several dates circled in red ink. March 10th had a note. Carter called. Wants to visit. March 12th. Carter and Marla here. Asked about finances. March 15th. Lawyers. Forced to sign. Forced to sign. My heart was pounding as I turned the pages. Photo after photo of documentation. Business cards from people I didn't recognize. Notes about phone calls that had upset her. Even recordings on her phone of conversations that sounded increasingly tense and coercive. She recorded phone calls? Tessa asked. She was old, but not foolish, Mrs. Rodriguez said. She knew they would say she was confused, that her memory was bad. So she made sure to have proof. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything. The pattern was clear. Starting about 8 weeks before Nana's death, Carter and Marla had begun an intensive campaign to convince her that I was irresponsible, that the art collection needed professional management, that the house was too much for someone like me to handle. There were notes about a private investigator they'd hired to look into my finances, proof that they'd been telling Nana I was in debt and struggling with addiction. Both lies. There were recordings of phone calls where Marla's voice grew increasingly threatening, suggestions that Nana might not be competent to make her own decisions if she continued being stubborn about the inheritance. This is elder abuse, Tessa said, her voice tight with anger. Emotional manipulation, financial coercion, all of it. But they got her to sign a new will, I pointed out. How do we prove she didn't do it willingly? Mrs. Rodriguez turned to the last page of the album. There, in a plastic sleeve, was a handwritten document in Nana's purple ink. She wrote her true will, Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly. The one she wanted. I witnessed it, along with Mrs. Chen from next door. We signed it the day before she died. I stared at the document, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing. It was simple and clear. Eleanor Harrington's estate, including the house and art collection, was to go to Jasmine Flores, her beloved granddaughter. Carter was mentioned only as a recipient of a small family heirloom, a watch that had belonged to his grandfather. Is this legal? I asked. If it's properly witnessed and she was of sound mind when she wrote it? Yes, Tessa said. This could override the will that was filed with the court, especially if we can prove the other one was signed under duress. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in 2 days. Not because of the money or the house or the art, but because this was my grandmother's voice. This was the woman who had raised me and loved me and wanted me to carry on her legacy. What do we do now? I asked. Now we fight, Tessa said. We take this evidence to a probate attorney, and we challenge the filed will. We expose what Carter and Marla did, and we make sure your grandmother's true wishes are honored. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since we'd arrived. Mrs. Eleanor would be proud of you, mija. She always said you had the heart of a fighter, even when you didn't know it yourself. As we drove back toward town, the album of evidence secure in Tessa's back seat, I felt something shifting inside me. The grief was still there, would probably always be there. But alongside it was a growing sense of purpose, of righteous anger that someone had dared to manipulate and threaten the woman I loved most in the world. Carter and Marla thought they'd won. They thought I was just a naive 27-year-old who would accept whatever scraps they threw my way. They thought Nana's love for me could be erased with forged documents and legal maneuvering. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The law office of Patricia Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen next door, despite the shared surname, occupied a converted Victorian house in the historic district, its turquoise exterior and climbing jasmine vines making it look more like a bed and breakfast than a place where legal battles were fought. But Patricia Chen had a reputation for taking on David versus Goliath cases, especially when elder abuse was involved. "This is significant," she said, looking up from the album of evidence we'd spread across her conference table. "Your grandmother was clearly documenting a pattern of harassment and coercion. These recordings alone could be grounds for criminal charges, not just will contest." Patricia was probably in her 50s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd seen every dirty trick in the book. Tessa had found her through a colleague who specialized in elder law, and her initial consultation had been encouraging enough that I'd decided to liquidate my meager savings. "Account to hire her. What are our chances?" I asked. "Good, if everything here is authentic. The handwritten will is particularly compelling. I can tell just from the handwriting that this was written by someone under less stress than whoever signed the will filed with the court." She pointed to Nana's purple ink document. "See how steady these letters are? Compare that to the signature on the official will." She pulled out copies of the documents Morrison had filed. Even I could see the difference. Nana's usual flowing script looked shaky and uncertain on the official papers, while her handwritten will showed the steady penmanship I remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists. "So what's our next step?" Tessa asked. "We file a formal contest with the probate court. I'll request handwriting analysis, examination of the original documents for forgery, and depositions from everyone who had contact with Eleanor in her final weeks." Patricia smiled grimly. If Carter and Marla thought they could intimidate an 83-year-old woman into compliance, wait until they meet me. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal filings, document review, and increasingly tense phone calls. Carter tried to reach me several times, his messages growing less friendly with each attempt. "Jasmine, I understand you have some concerns about grandmother's will," he said in one voicemail. "But I think you're being influenced by people who don't have your best interests at heart. We're family. We should be able to work this out without involving lawyers." In another, "This is getting out of hand. You're embarrassing the family name and wasting everyone's time and money." Grandmother made her decision, and it wasn't made lightly. By the third message, the pretense of concern had dropped entirely. "You need to stop this nonsense before it goes too far. You have no idea what you're dealing with, and you're going to end up with nothing instead of the generous bequest grandmother left you." I saved every message. Patricia said they might be useful as evidence of continued harassment. Meanwhile, I'd started spending my days at the house. Officially, I was there to water the garden and make sure the property was secure. But really, I just needed to be close to Nana's memory while this legal battle played out. The roses were blooming spectacularly, just as she'd predicted, and the herb garden was ready for its first harvest of the season. It was during one of these visits that Eli Moran knocked on the front door. I almost didn't answer, Carter had driven by twice that week, and I wasn't ready for another confrontation. But when I peeked through the curtains, I saw a tall, lean man in his 30s, holding a messenger bag and looking uncertain about whether anyone was home. "Can I help you?" I asked, through the door. "I'm looking for Jasmine Flores. I'm Eli Moran from the Crescent Bluffs Historical Society. I had an appointment with Mrs. Harrington about some research, and I wanted to offer my condolences and see if the family still wanted the work completed." I opened the door. Eli had dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through. He had kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of gentle demeanor that suggested he spent more time with books than people. There was something immediately trustworthy about him, maybe because he looked as uncomfortable with social interaction as I felt. "I'm Jasmine," I said. "What kind of research were you doing for my grandmother?" "Authentication work on some of her older family documents. She wanted to verify the provenance of several pieces in her art collection for insurance purposes." He shifted his bag to his other shoulder. "I'm sorry for your loss. Mrs. Harrington was remarkable, so knowledgeable about her family's history. Thank you. Please come in." I led him to the living room, where the Rivera still hung above the fireplace, and the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the windows in the way that had made Nana happy every single day. "She was very proud of this collection," Eli said, looking around with obvious appreciation. "Especially the pieces with family connections. She told me stories about how her grandfather acquired some of these works that were absolutely fascinating. She loved those stories. We were working on a memoir together. She wanted to make sure the history was preserved. I'd love to hear more about that project sometime. But first, I should explain what I was doing for her." He pulled a folder from his bag. She'd asked me to research the documentation for several high-value pieces, particularly the Rivera and the Kahlo self-portrait. She was concerned that some of the provenance papers might not be complete. I frowned. Was there a problem with the authenticity? Oh no. The pieces are definitely authentic. But the documentation, bills of sale, export permits, insurance records, was incomplete in a few cases. Your grandmother wanted to make sure everything was properly documented, especially if... He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. If what? She mentioned that there might be family disputes about the collection after her death. She wanted to make sure there was clear documentation of ownership and provenance so that whoever inherited the pieces would have complete legal title. Family disputes. Even in her research projects, Nana had been preparing for what she suspected was coming. "Did she say anything specific about these potential disputes?" I asked. Eli hesitated. She seemed concerned that someone might claim the collection had been improperly acquired, or that certain pieces belonged to other family members. She wanted ironclad documentation to prevent any challenges. We spent the next hour going through Eli's research. He'd uncovered fascinating details about how my great-grandfather had acquired each piece, including several works that were even more valuable than Nana had realized. But more importantly, he'd found evidence that the collection had been legally purchased and properly imported, with clear title passing to Eleanor upon her grandfather's death. "This is incredibly thorough," I said, flipping through pages of certificates, bills of sale, and export documentation. She must have spent a fortune on this research. "Actually, she didn't pay me," Eli said. "She offered to let me include some of these findings in a paper I'm writing about art collection patterns among California families in the mid-20th century. The historical significance was payment enough." Something about the way he said it, like he genuinely cared more about the history than the money, reminded me of Nana. She'd always believed that passion was more valuable than profit, that the people who loved something were better caretakers than those who merely owned it. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "In your professional opinion, would someone without art history background be capable of properly caring for a collection like this?" Eli looked surprised by the question. "It depends. Caring for art isn't just about having credentials. It's about understanding the responsibility. Your grandmother told me you'd been learning about each piece, studying their history and significance. That kind of personal investment often matters more than formal training. Even for pieces worth millions? Especially for pieces worth millions. Museums are full of art that's technically well-preserved, but emotionally disconnected from its history. Private collectors who truly understand what they're protecting often do a better job of maintaining both the physical integrity and the cultural significance of important works. After Eli left, I sat in the living room as the sun set over the ocean, thinking about everything he'd said. Nana hadn't just been preparing me to inherit her art collection. She'd been preparing me to defend it. The research, the documentation, even the memoir project. All of it was building a case for why someone like me, someone who loved and understood the history, was a better steward than someone who saw only financial value. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Hearing scheduled for next Friday. Are you ready? I looked around the room at the faces that had watched over my childhood, at the walls that had sheltered decades of family stories, at the garden visible through the windows where Nana and I had planned a future that someone else had tried to steal. Yes, I texted back. I'm ready. But even as I typed the words, I felt a flutter of anxiety. Legal hearings weren't just about evidence and documentation. They were about convincing people, about making a case that justice mattered more than convenience. Carter and Marla had money, connections, and the kind of polished respectability that judges often found persuasive. All I had was the truth, and the growing conviction that sometimes that had to be enough. That night, I dreamed about Nana working in her garden, her hands covered in soil, and her face turned toward the sun. In the dream, she looked up at me and smiled. Don't let them rewrite our story, mija, she said. Some things are too important to lose. I woke up knowing exactly what I had to do. The email arrived at 6:23 a.m. on Tuesday morning, 3 days before our scheduled hearing. I almost deleted it as spam. The subject line read Urgent Family Matter, and the sender was an address I didn't recognize. But something made me open it. Maybe the same instinct that had driven Nana to document everything in her final weeks. Jasmine, it began. You don't know me, but I know about what's happening with your grandmother's will. We need to meet. There are things about Carter and your family that you need to know before Friday. Come alone to the address below at 3 p.m. today. A friend. The address was for a coffee shop in the next town over, far enough from Crescent Bluffs that we were unlikely to be seen by anyone who knew us. Every instinct I had screamed that this was either a trap or a scam, but desperation makes you consider possibilities you'd normally dismiss. I forwarded the email to Tessa with a message. This is probably crazy, but what if it isn't? She called, me within 5 minutes. Absolutely not, she said. This has bad idea written all over it. Anonymous emails, secret meetings. This is how people end up as cautionary tales on true crime podcasts. But what if someone else knows what Carter and Marla did? What if there are other victims? Then they can contact Patricia through proper legal channels. They can give a deposition or submit evidence through the court system. They don't need to meet you in some sketchy coffee shop an hour away. She was right, of course. I knew she was right. But I also knew that in 3 days, I'd be sitting in a courtroom trying to convince a judge that my family had committed fraud, and I still felt like I was missing pieces of the puzzle. Come with me, I said. If it's legitimate, we'll learn something useful. If it's not, at least I won't be alone. Tessa sighed heavily. I'm going to regret this, but yes, I'll come. And I'm bringing pepper spray. The Bluebird Cafe sat on the outskirts of Santa Monica, one of those aggressively quaint places with mismatched furniture and local art covering every available wall space. It was busy enough that we could blend in, but quiet enough for private conversation, which made me think whoever had chosen it knew what they were doing. I'd been nursing a cup of coffee for 20 minutes when a woman in her 40s approached our table. She was expensively dressed but nervous, constantly glancing around like she expected to be followed. Jasmine? She asked quietly. Yes. I'm Rebecca Hartwell. Thank you for coming. She sat down across from us, declined our offer to buy her coffee, and got straight to the point. 5 years ago, Carter and Marla did to my family exactly what they're doing to you. The bottom fell out of my stomach. What do you mean? My mother-in-law, Catherine Hartwell. She was 86, wealthy, and starting to show signs of dementia. Carter was handling some of her investments through his firm, and he convinced her that her son, my husband, was financially irresponsible. By the time she died, her will had been changed to leave everything to a trust managed by Carter's company, with my family receiving only a small annual stipend. Tessa leaned forward. Did you contest it? We tried, but the documentation looked legitimate, and Catherine's dementia diagnosis made it easy for them to claim she'd made the changes because she was worried about David's ability to manage money. The court ruled that the new will reflected her wishes to protect her assets from potential mismanagement. But you think it was fraud? Rebecca nodded. I know it was fraud. Catherine told me repeatedly in her final months that she wanted David to inherit everything, that she didn't trust Carter despite his professional credentials. But she was scared. Marla had convinced her that if she didn't change the will, David might contest her mental competency and have her declared unfit. The pattern was sickeningly familiar. Create fear, offer a solution, manipulate the outcome. Why? Are you telling us this now? I asked. Because I've been watching what happened with your grandmother, and I can't let them do it again. Catherine's trust still has millions in it, money that should have gone to my children's college funds and our retirement. Carter's been collecting management fees for 5 years while we struggle to pay our mortgage. She pulled a thick envelope from her purse. I've been documenting everything I could find about Carter's business practices, his clients, his methods. There's a pattern. He targets elderly clients with significant assets and family complications, then manipulates them into changing their estate plans in ways that benefit his company. How many people? Tessa asked. At least 6 that I've been able to identify, probably more. He's very good at covering his tracks, and he chooses victims whose families are unlikely to have the resources to fight back. Rebecca slid the envelope across the table. Financial records, client lists, email communications I obtained through my husband's business relationship with one of Carter's former associates. It's not enough to convict him criminally, but it might be enough to establish a pattern for your civil case. I opened the envelope to find dozens of documents, photocopied bank statements, and what looked like internal communications from Carter's investment firm. Even a quick glance showed names, dates, and dollar amounts that suggested Rebecca was telling the truth. Why didn't you go to the police? I asked. With what? A feeling that something was wrong? Suspicions about my mother-in-law's mental state? Carter's too smart to leave obvious evidence, and these people are too powerful to take down without ironclad proof. Her voice grew bitter. Besides, who's going to believe that a successful investment banker is running elaborate cons on his own clients' families? We spent another hour going through the documents, while Rebecca explained what she'd learned about Carter's methods. He typically approached elderly clients through social connections or professional referrals, presenting himself as a concerned family member who wanted to help with estate planning. He'd identify family tensions or concerns about inheritance, then exploit those anxieties to convince his targets that their current plans were flawed. He's particularly good at finding clients whose families are already dealing with money-related stress, Rebecca explained. Divorced children, grandchildren with student loans, anyone who might be perceived as financially irresponsible. He uses those vulnerabilities to justify why the inheritance should be professionally managed instead of distributed directly. And the legal documents? That's where Marla comes in. She has connections with several law firms that specialize in estate planning, lawyers who are willing to prepare documents quickly and without asking too many questions if the fee is right. By the time we left the cafe, I felt sick with anger and vindication. Angry that Carter and Marla had built a business model around exploiting grieving families. Vindicated that my instincts about the will had been correct. This changes everything, Tessa said as we drove back to Crescent Bluffs. If Patricia can establish a pattern of similar behavior, it supports our argument that Eleanor was coerced. Will the judge allow this kind of evidence? Depends on how Patricia presents it. It's not directly related to your grandmother's case, but it could be admitted to show Carter's intent and method of operation. That evening, I called Patricia to arrange an emergency meeting. She was initially skeptical about Rebecca's motives. Anonymous. Tipsters weren't always reliable, but when she saw the documents, her attitude shifted to grimly satisfied. "This is gold," she said, spreading the papers across her conference table. "Look at these dates. Carter approached 3 different elderly clients within months of each other, all with similar family dynamics, all resulting in similar changes to their estate plans. Is it enough to win? It's enough to make Carter and Marla very, very uncomfortable. And sometimes that's all you need." The next morning, Patricia filed an emergency motion to include Rebecca's evidence in our case, arguing that it demonstrated a pattern of elder abuse that was directly relevant to Eleanor's situation. Carter's lawyers filed an immediate objection, claiming the evidence was prejudicial and irrelevant. By Thursday afternoon, the judge had ruled that a limited portion of Rebecca's documentation could be presented, specifically the communications that showed Carter's systematic approach to targeting elderly clients. "It's not everything we wanted," Patricia told me over the phone. "But it's enough to plant seeds of doubt about Carter's motives." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Rebecca's story, about Catherine Hartwell and the other families who'd been victimized, about the systematic nature of what Carter and Marla had been doing. This wasn't just about my inheritance anymore. It was about stopping a pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. I also thought about Nana, about how scared she must have been in those final weeks when she realized what was happening. She'd been protecting me the only way she knew how, documenting everything and hoping someone would eventually connect the dots. Tomorrow, I'd have my chance to honor that protection, to make sure her voice was heard and her true wishes were respected. But, more than that, I'd have a chance to speak for Catherine Hartwell and all the other elderly victims whose trust had been betrayed by people who were supposed to protect them. At 2 a.m., I got up and wrote a letter to Nana, telling her about Rebecca, and the evidence and my promise to fight not just for myself, but for everyone who'd been hurt by Carter's schemes. I sealed it in an envelope and put it in the jewelry box where she'd hidden her own letter to me. Some promises are too important to break, even when the person you're making them to can't hear you anymore. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes California famous. Endless blue sky, gentle breeze off the ocean, the sort of day that should have been perfect for walking on the beach or working in the garden. Instead, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror at 6 a.m., trying to decide which version of myself to present to Judge Harrison. Patricia had advised professional, but not flashy. You want to look competent and respectful, but not like you're trying to compete with Carter's expensive lawyers. I'd settled on a navy blue dress Nana had bought me for my college graduation, paired with the pearl earrings from her jewelry box. If I was going to fight for her legacy, I wanted to carry a piece of her with me. Tessa picked me up at 7:30, looking fierce in her best courtroom attire, a charcoal gray suit that made her look older and more intimidating than her 28 years. She'd taken the day off work to be there, claiming it was the most interesting case she'd encountered since starting at the law firm. "How are you feeling?" she asked as we drove toward the courthouse. Terrified, determined, ready to throw up. I took a sip of coffee from Nana's travel mug, hoping the familiar ritual would calm my nerves. What if the judge doesn't believe us? What if Carter's lawyers make me look like a greedy granddaughter who can't accept reality? Then we'll appeal. And if that doesn't work, we'll take it to the media. Sometimes public pressure accomplishes what legal pressure can't. The courthouse was the imposing neoclassical building that had been built in the 1920s, all marble columns and soaring ceilings designed to make visitors feel the weight of justice. We met Patricia in the hallway outside the courtroom, where she was reviewing her notes and looking as calm as if she were preparing for a routine hearing instead of the fight of my life. "Remember," she said, "you're not just fighting for money or property. You're fighting for your grandmother's autonomy, Her right to make her own decisions about who should inherit her life's work. That's a principle worth defending, regardless of the dollar amount involved. Through the courtroom windows, I could see Carter and Marla arriving with their legal team. 3 lawyers in expensive suits, carrying briefcases that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Carter looked every inch the successful businessman, confident and composed, while Marla wore the kind of understated elegance that screamed old money and social connections. "They look like they own the place," I muttered. "Good," Patricia said. "Overconfidence leads to mistakes." Judge Harrison turned out to be a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades sorting truth from fiction. She listened to the preliminary arguments with the kind of focused attention that suggested she took estate disputes seriously, especially when elder abuse was alleged. Carter's lead attorney, a man named Thompson who spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, presented their case first. Eleanor Harrington, he argued, had been a sharp, independent woman who'd made careful decisions about her estate based on practical concerns about asset management and family dynamics. Mrs. Harrington was concerned about her granddaughter's financial instability and lack of experience with significant assets, Thompson said. She wanted to ensure that her life's work would be preserved and managed by someone with the business acumen to protect it for future generations. He presented evidence of my student loans, my modest income as a freelance illustrator, my small apartment above a bookstore. On paper, it looked like exactly the kind of financial irresponsibility that might worry a practical grandmother. Furthermore, Thompson continued, Mrs. Harrington's final will was prepared by the same law firm that had handled her affairs for decades, witnessed by reputable professionals, and signed by someone who was demonstrably competent at the time of execution. When Patricia stood to present our case, the atmosphere in the room shifted. She was smaller than Thompson, less flashy, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. "Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about financial competence or business acumen. It's about an elderly woman who was systematically manipulated and coerced into abandoning her deeply held wishes about her legacy." She started with the album Mrs. Rodriguez had compiled, walking the judge through each piece of evidence that demonstrated the campaign of harassment Eleanor had endured. The phone calls that grew increasingly threatening, the private investigator, hired to dig up dirt on me, the lies about my supposed addiction and financial irresponsibility. Mrs. Harrington documented this pattern of abuse because she knew her family would try to claim her final decisions were made willingly, Patricia said. She knew that her age and recent health concerns would be used against her, so she created a comprehensive record of what was really happening. The handwritten will was presented next, along with testimony from Mrs. Rodriguez and Mrs. Chen about Eleanor's mental state when she'd written it. Both women described a woman who was scared but determined, someone who understood exactly what she was doing when she chose to override the coerced document with her true wishes. "This is the voice of Eleanor Harrington," Patricia said, reading aloud from the handwritten will. "To my beloved granddaughter Jasmine, who has shown me more love and loyalty than I ever thought possible. The house, the art collection, and all my assets should go to someone who understands that stewardship is about love, not profit." Then came the bombshell. Rebecca Hartwell's evidence. Patricia had carefully selected the most damning documents from Rebecca's collection, focusing on communications that showed Carter's systematic approach to targeting elderly clients. Email exchanges between Carter and Marla discussing vulnerable prospects, financial analyses of potential inheritance targets, even a training document that outlined strategies for convincing elderly clients that their families were financially irresponsible. "Your Honor," Patricia said, "this evidence demonstrates that what happened to Eleanor Harrington was not an isolated incident, but part of a calculated pattern of elder abuse designed to redirect family wealth into accounts controlled by the defendants." Thompson objected vigorously, arguing that the evidence was prejudicial and irrelevant to Eleanor's specific case, but Judge Harrison allowed the presentation to continue, clearly disturbed by the implications of what she was hearing. The turning point came when Patricia played one of Eleanor's recorded phone conversations with Marla. The audio quality was Poor, recorded on an old smartphone from across the room, but the content was devastating. Marla's voice, cold and threatening. Eleanor, you need to understand that leaving everything to Jasmine would be a disaster. She has no idea how to manage assets of this magnitude. The art collection alone requires specialized knowledge that she simply doesn't possess. Eleanor's voice, shaky but defiant. Jasmine has been learning about the collection for years. She knows the history of each piece. She understands their significance. Knowing stories isn't the same as knowing how to preserve and protect millions of dollars worth of art. And frankly, her financial situation suggests she might be tempted to sell pieces to pay off her debts. What debts? Jasmine is very responsible with money. Are you sure about that? Because our research suggests otherwise. Did you know she's been borrowing money from friends to pay her rent? This was a lie. I'd never borrowed money from anyone, and my rent was always paid on time. But the recording captured Eleanor's sharp intake of breath, her moment of uncertainty. I don't believe that. Believe what you want, Eleanor. But if you leave your estate to someone who's already financially unstable, don't be surprised when the collection ends up scattered to the highest bidders. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Marla systematically undermining Eleanor's confidence in me while presenting Carter as the responsible alternative. By the end of the recording, you could hear the exhaustion in Eleanor's voice, the weight of being constantly told that her instincts were wrong. When the audio stopped, the courtroom was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Judge Harrison looked like someone who'd just witnessed a crime in progress. Thompson tried to recover during cross-examination, arguing that the recording proved Eleanor had legitimate concerns about my financial stability, and that family discussions about inheritance weren't automatically coercive. But the damage was done. The recording had captured the systematic nature of the manipulation, the way Marla had used lies and fear to wear down an elderly woman's resistance. Your Honor, Patricia said in her closing argument, this case represents everything that's wrong with how we treat elderly people in our society. Eleanor Harrington was not a confused old woman who didn't understand her own mind. She was a victim of financial abuse, systematically targeted because of her age and her assets. She gestured toward me. Jasmine Flores isn't asking for money. She didn't earn or property she doesn't deserve. She's asking this court to honor the true wishes of a woman who was coerced into betraying her own values. She's asking for justice for someone who can no longer speak for herself. Judge Harrison took a 20-minute recess to consider her decision. I spent those 20 minutes in the courthouse bathroom, splashing cold water on my face and trying not to think about what would happen if we lost. Not just the money or the house, but the knowledge that Carter and Marla would continue their pattern of abuse with other families, other elderly victims who might not have anyone willing to fight for them. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Harrison's expression was unreadable. This court has heard compelling evidence on both sides, she began. Mr. Carter Harrington is clearly a successful businessman with the credentials to manage significant assets. However, this court is deeply troubled by the evidence of systematic manipulation and coercion directed toward Eleanor Harrington in her final weeks. She paused, looking directly at Carter and Marla. The recorded conversations and documented pattern of harassment present a clear picture of elder abuse. While Eleanor Harrington may have had legitimate concerns about asset management, those concerns appear to have been artificially created and amplified through a campaign of misinformation and emotional manipulation. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, the handwritten will presented by the plaintiff appears to reflect Eleanor Harrington's true wishes, created at a time when she was free from the immediate pressure of the defendant's coercive campaign. She looked down at her notes, then back up at us. This court finds that the will filed for probate was executed under duress and does not reflect the genuine wishes of the decedent. The handwritten will dated one day before Eleanor Harrington's death is hereby recognized as her valid final testament. The words hit me like a physical force. We'd won. Not just the case, but vindication for Nana. Justice for all the manipulation and fear she'd endured. recognition that her love for me had been real and her wishes legitimate. Additionally, Judge Harrison added, this court is referring the evidence of potential criminal elder abuse to the district attorney's office for investigation. The pattern of behavior documented in this case warrants further scrutiny. I looked over at Carter and Marla. For the first time since I'd known them, they looked genuinely shocked. Their expensive lawyers were already whispering about appeals and next steps, but the damage was done. Their pattern of abuse had been exposed, their methods documented in court records that would follow them forever. As we left the courthouse, Patricia pulled me aside. You did it, she said. You fought for your grandmother and you won. We all did it, I corrected. Nana, Mrs. Rodriguez, Rebecca, Tessa, you, everyone who refused to let them get away with it. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Eleanor Harrington was buried under a simple headstone that bore her name, her dates, and the words, "Beloved Grandmother." I knelt in the grass beside her grave and told her everything that had happened, how her documentation had saved not just my inheritance but potentially countless other families from Carter's schemes. I promise I'll take care of everything you loved, I said to the headstone. The house, the art, the garden, all of it. But mostly, I promise I'll remember what you taught me about love being more important than money, about showing up for the people who matter. The wind picked up, rustling through the oak trees that shaded the cemetery, and for just a moment I could have sworn I heard Nana's voice carried on the breeze. That's my girl, mija. That's my fighter. The keys to 47 Cliffside Drive felt different, in my hand this time, heavier somehow, weighted with responsibility and possibility rather than grief and nostalgia. It was Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after Judge Harrison's ruling, and I was finally coming home to the house that had always been mine in every way that mattered. The legal transfer would take a few more weeks to complete, but Patricia had arranged for me to take immediate possession since the court had invalidated Carter's claim. The first thing I did was change the locks, not because I was worried about security, but because I needed the symbolic gesture of starting fresh. Tessa helped me carry my belongings from the tiny apartment above Morrison's bookstore, though belongings was a generous term for my collection of art supplies, secondhand furniture, and books. Everything I owned fit into her Honda with room to spare, a reminder of how simply I'd been living while Nana's house had sat empty, waiting for its rightful owner to claim it. It's going to be weird, living in a place with more than one room, I said, setting down a box of illustration supplies in what used to be my grandfather's study. Good weird or bad weird? Overwhelming weird. Yesterday, I was a freelance illustrator living paycheck to paycheck. Today, I'm the owner of a multi-million-dollar art collection and a house that could probably fit my old apartment in the front. Hallway. The house felt different too. Not empty exactly, but expectant, like it had been holding its breath waiting for life to return. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room windows, and the grandfather. Clock in the hallway had stopped ticking at 3:47, the exact time I'd gotten the call about Nana's death. I wound the clock first, needing to hear its familiar rhythm echoing through the rooms again. Then I opened all the windows to let in the ocean breeze and the sound of waves that had been the soundtrack of every childhood visit. Where do you want to start? Tessa asked. The garden, I said without hesitation. Nana always said you can't properly live in a house until its garden is alive. We spent the afternoon outside, me rediscovering the rhythm of tending plants while Tessa provided moral support and occasional help with the heavier work. The roses were still blooming magnificently, but they needed deadheading. The herb garden was overgrown but salvageable. The vegetable plot Nana had prepared in early spring was now a tangle of weeds and volunteer tomatoes. She would have loved this harvest, I said, picking cherry tomatoes that had managed to ripen despite the neglect. She always said the best. Tomatoes were the ones the plants decided to grow themselves. Are you going to keep doing the memoir? Tessa asked, settling onto the stone bench where Nana and I had shared our last conversation. I have to. It's only half finished, and there are so many stories still to tell. I paused in my weeding to look up at the house, its Victorian gingerbread trim and weathered shingles telling their own story of endurance and grace. But I think I want to expand it beyond just Nana's life. I want to include what happened with Carter and Marla, what we learned about elder abuse, maybe even some of the other families' stories if they're willing to share. Like a cautionary tale. More like a survival guide. Information people can use to protect their own elderly relatives. Warning signs to watch for. Resources for fighting back when someone tries to manipulate the system. The idea had been growing in my mind since the court hearing, fueled by anger at what Carter and Marla had done, and determination to prevent it from happening to other families. Rebecca had called twice since the ruling, once to thank me for exposing the pattern, and once to discuss the possibility of a class action lawsuit against Carter's investment firm. The district attorney is definitely moving forward with criminal charges, she'd told me. Your case gave them the evidence they needed to take it seriously. What about the other families? That's the beautiful part. Once word gets out about the criminal investigation, I think more victims will come forward. Carter's been operating on the assumption that families wouldn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. Now that someone has proven it's possible, others might find the courage to speak up. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that would have made the artists on Nana's walls weep with envy, I sat on the back porch and called Eli Moran. Jasmine, I heard about the court ruling. Congratulations. How are you handling everything? It's surreal, I admitted, but I wanted to ask you something. Would you be interested in helping me finish the authentication research Nana started, and maybe expanding it to include the family history behind each piece? Are you thinking of donating the collection? Eventually, maybe, but right now I'm thinking of living with it, learning from it, making sure each piece's story gets told properly before I decide what happens next. There was a pause then. I'd love to help with that. Your grandmother's collection is remarkable not just for the individual pieces, but for what it represents about American art patronage in the mid-20th century. It deserves to be studied and celebrated. There's something else, I said. I'm thinking of opening the house for occasional tours, maybe partnering with the Historical Society to educate people about the art and the family history. Nothing commercial, just sharing it. That's exactly what Eleanor would have wanted, Eli said, and something in his voice suggested he wasn't just talking about the professional opportunity. She always believed art was meant to be experienced, not hoarded. After we hung up, I wandered through the house as darkness fell, turning on lamps and acquainting myself with the night sounds of a place I'd only ever visited during daylight hours. The grandfather clock chimed 9 o'clock, then 9:30, marking time in a house that was learning to be lived in again. I found myself in Nana's bedroom, standing in front of the antique vanity where she'd kept her jewelry and perfume bottles. The room still smelled faintly of her lavender sachets, a ghost of presence that was comforting rather than sad. On the vanity, I arranged the few pieces of jewelry she'd left me. The wedding ring, the pearl earrings, a delicate gold bracelet that had belonged to her mother. Not valuable in monetary terms, but priceless as connections to the women who'd shaped our family's story. Beside the jewelry, I placed the letter she'd hidden for me to find, the words that had started this entire journey of discovery and justice. Then I added something new. A framed photograph of the two of us taken last Christmas. Both of us laughing at something ridiculous, surrounded by the art collection that had brought us together and would continue connecting us even though she was gone. I'm home, Nana, I said to the photograph, and I'm going to take care of everything you loved, just like I promised. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. You have no idea what you've done to this family. Enjoy. Your victory while it lasts. Carter, no doubt. Or maybe Marla. The criminal investigation had been announced that afternoon, along with news that the state attorney general was looking into Carter's investment firm for potential fraud. Their world was collapsing, and they wanted someone to blame. I took a screenshot of the message to forward to Patricia. Harassment from defendants was taken seriously by courts, especially in elder abuse cases. Then I deleted the text and blocked the number. Carter and Marla had taken up enough space in my life. They didn't deserve any more of my emotional energy. Instead, I focused on the future I was building in this house. The memoir to finish, the garden to restore, the art collection to study and eventually share, the responsibility of being not just an owner, but a steward, caring for things that mattered more than their monetary value. I fell asleep that first night in my childhood bedroom, the same room where I'd spent countless weekends reading Nancy, drew mysteries and listening to Nana tell stories about the family members whose portraits hung on the walls. The ocean waves provided a lullaby, and for the first time since her death, I dreamed of Eleanor Harrington smiling. In the dream, she was working in her garden again, but now I was working beside her as an equal partner rather than an eager student. We moved through the rows of flowers and vegetables in comfortable synchrony, two women caring for growing things under an endless California sky. "You did good, mija," she said, as we deadheaded roses together. "You fought for what was right, and you won." "I had help," I reminded her. "You, Mrs. Rodriguez, Tessa, Patricia, even Rebecca and all those other families Carter hurt. It wasn't just me." "No," she agreed. "But you were the one who chose to fight instead of accepting what they told you. You were the one who trusted your heart when everyone else was telling you to be practical." I woke up Sunday morning with sunlight, streaming through windows that were truly mine, in a house that was finally home again. The grandfather clock was chiming 8 o'clock, marking time in a place where past and future came together in the eternal present of love and memory. There was work to do, legal paperwork to sign, insurance policies to update, a garden that needed tending and a collection that needed cataloging. But for the first time in months, it felt like joyful work, the kind of labor that connects you to something larger than yourself. I made coffee in Nana's kitchen, using her favorite blue ceramic mug, and carried it out to the garden where the morning light was just beginning to touch the roses she'd loved so much. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of church bells from St. Mary's by the sea, calling the faithful to worship. I wasn't particularly religious, but standing in that garden with the ocean breeze in my hair and the weight of inherited responsibility on my shoulders, I understood what Nana had always known. Some things are sacred not because they're blessed by institutions, but because they're blessed by love. This house, this garden, this collection of art and memories and stories, all of it was sacred because it had been loved, and because it would continue to be loved by someone who understood the difference between ownership and stewardship. The battle was over. The inheritance was secure, but more importantly, the legacy was in the right hands. Hands that would tend it carefully, share it generously, and pass it on to future generations who would understand that some things matter more than money. 6. Months later, I stood in the same garden where Nana and I had shared our last conversation, but everything was different now. The roses she'd been pruning that final Saturday were in their second bloom of the season, more vibrant than ever. The herb garden had expanded to include varieties she'd only dreamed of growing, and the vegetable plot was producing enough bounty to share with half the neighborhood. "The morning light is perfect," Eli said, adjusting his camera angle to capture the way the sun illuminated the Diego Rivera piece above the fireplace. "This is going to be a beautiful spread for the Historical Society newsletter. We'd been documenting the collection for weeks now, preparing for the first public tours that would begin next month." The Harrington House Arts and History Project, as we'd decided to call it, was exactly the kind of community resource Nana would have loved. Educational, accessible, and focused on sharing rather than hoarding cultural treasures. "How many people have signed up for the inaugural tour?" I asked, deadheading roses while he worked. 43, and we're still getting calls. Apparently there's been a lot of interest since the newspaper article came out. The article had been Tessa's idea, a human interest piece about the inheritance battle and its aftermath, focusing on the positive outcome rather than the legal drama. The reporter had been fascinated by the story of an elderly woman who documented her own abuse and the granddaughter who'd fought to honor her wishes. "It's not just about one family's wealth," I'd told the journalist. "It's about recognizing that elderly people have the right to make their own decisions about their legacy, and that families have the responsibility to protect that right even when it's difficult." The article had generated more attention than I'd expected. 3 other families had contacted Patricia about potential elder abuse cases. The state attorney general's office had used our case as a model for new guidelines about investigating inheritance disputes. And Carter's investment firm was facing a federal investigation that could result in criminal charges. "Have you heard anything more about the criminal case?" Eli asked, settling his camera equipment on the stone bench. "Patricia says the grand jury is expected to issue indictments next month. Carter and Marla both, along with 2 of the lawyers who helped them process fraudulent documents." I paused in my gardening to look up at the house that had become both my home and my purpose. It won't bring Nana back, but it might prevent other families from going through what we went through. The memoir was finished now too, expanded from Nana's personal story into a broader exploration of family, legacy, and the courage required to stand up for what's right. Rebecca Hartwell had contributed a chapter about her family's experience, and I'd included resources for recognizing and reporting elder abuse. The local historical society was going to publish it as a fundraiser, with proceeds supporting elder advocacy programs. "I brought you something," Eli said, pulling a manila envelope from his camera bag. The final authentication report on the Kahlo self-portrait. I opened it carefully, still amazed by the formal documentation that proved what Nana had always known. This wasn't just a valuable painting, but a significant piece of art history, with a clear provenance and fascinating backstory. "The insurance company wants to display it at their annual art exhibition," Eli continued. "They're calling it Hidden Treasures, private collections with public significance. Interested? Will there be proper security? Museum grade. Climate control, professional handling, the works. I considered it while finishing the roses. 6 months ago, the idea of lending Nana's art to exhibitions would have terrified me. Too much risk, too much responsibility. But I'd been learning that stewardship sometimes meant sharing, that keeping treasures hidden didn't honor their significance. "Yes," I said finally, "but I want to write the exhibition notes myself. Tell the story of how my great-grandfather acquired it and what it meant to our family." "Deal." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, Eli documenting the collection while I tended the garden that had become my meditation practice. The routine of watering, weeding, and harvesting had helped me process the grief and anger of the past year, connecting me to the cycle of growth and renewal that Nana had always found healing. My phone rang, interrupting the peaceful morning. Tessa's name appeared on the screen. "Emergency," she said as soon as I answered. "But a good emergency. Turn on Channel 7 News right now." "What's happening?" "Just turn it on. Trust me." I called for Eli and we hurried inside to the living room, where I fumbled with the remote to find the local news channel. A familiar face appeared on screen. Rebecca Hartwell, standing outside the federal courthouse with a group of other people I didn't recognize. Class action lawsuit filed today represents 6 families who believe they were victimized by systematic elder abuse, the reporter was saying. The plaintiffs are seeking not only financial compensation, but changes to how estate planning is regulated in California. The camera shifted to Rebecca, who looked composed and determined. "This isn't about money," she said. "It's about protecting elderly people from predators who exploit their trust and manipulate their families. What happened to my mother-in-law and to Eleanor Harrington was wrong, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The lawsuit names investment advisor Carter Harrington and several associated law firms, the reporter continued. Harrington's attorney declined to comment, but sources close to the case suggest this could be the largest elder abuse lawsuit in state history. I sank onto the couch, overwhelmed by the scope of what was happening. What had started as one granddaughter Fighting for her inheritance had become a movement, a recognition that elder abuse was a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions. "You did this," Eli said quietly. "Your willingness to fight opened the door for all these other families. We did this, all of us together." I thought about the chain of courage that had led to this moment. Nana documenting her abuse despite her fear. Mrs. Rodriguez keeping evidence safe. Rebecca reaching out to share her story. Tessa using her legal knowledge to help. Patricia taking on a case that could have destroyed her reputation if we'd lost. "What happens now?" Eli asked. "Now we keep going," I said. "Keep telling the story, keep sharing the collection, keep fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." That evening, I hosted the first of what I'd decided would be monthly dinner, parties in Nana's honor. Nothing fancy, just good food, good wine, and good conversation among people who cared about art, history, and justice. Tessa brought her boyfriend, Patricia came with her wife, Mrs. Rodriguez and Mrs. Chen represented the neighborhood, and Eli provided both photography skills and surprisingly good humor for someone who spent most of his time with books and artifacts. "Tsuen." "Eleanor," Patricia said, raising her glass in a toast. "Who knew that love is the most powerful force in any legal battle?" "To Jasmine," added Mrs. Rodriguez, who had the courage to fight for what was right. "To all the families who will be protected because someone was brave enough to speak up," Tessa said. We ate at the dining room table under the gentle gaze of Frida Kahlo's self-portrait, surrounded by art that had witnessed decades of family meals and conversations. The grandfather clock chimed 9 o'clock. Then 9:30, marking time in a house that was fully alive again. After everyone left, I sat on the back porch with the last glass of wine, listening to the ocean waves and thinking about the future. I was building in this place. Tomorrow I'd start writing the next chapter of the memoir, focusing on what I'd learned about courage and community in the months since Nana's death. Next week, I'd meet with the Historical Society about expanding the tour program. Next month, I'd testify in the criminal case against Carter and Marla, adding my voice to the chorus demanding justice for elderly victims. But tonight, I just sat with the contentment of knowing I was exactly where I belonged, caring for things that mattered and sharing them with people who understood their significance. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the news about the lawsuit. "I'm sorry for what my family put you through. You were right to fight. Carter." I stared at the message for a long time, surprised by the acknowledgement and the apparent sincerity. Maybe facing criminal charges and public disgrace had given Carter some perspective on what he'd done. Maybe he was just trying to minimize his legal exposure. Either way, his apology was too little and too late to change anything. But it was something. I deleted the text without responding. Carter had taken up enough space in my life. I had better things to focus on. A garden to tend, a collection to share, a story to tell, and a legacy to honor. As I locked up the house and headed upstairs to the bedroom that had been mine as a child and was mine again as an adult, I felt Nana's presence in the familiar creaks of the floorboards and the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living part of the love that connected past and future in this house that had always been my home. "Sweet dreams, mija," I whispered to the photograph on my bedside table, the one of us laughing together last Christmas. "Thank you for teaching me that some things are worth fighting for." Outside my window, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, waves breaking against the rocks below, in a pattern that had soothed Harrington family dreams for more than a century. Inside, the art collection kept its silent vigil, ready to share its stories with visitors who would learn that beauty and love are the most powerful forces in any inheritance. I fell asleep, surrounded by the contentment of knowing that justice had been served, truth had been honored, and love had triumphed over greed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight I was simply a granddaughter who had kept her promises, living in a house where every room held proof that some legacies are too important to lose. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.